Good afternoon. It's an honor for me to be here with you today. I think I'll start off just by giving an introduction about myself first, because most of you won't know me. So I'm a South African, born in Johannesburg, and raised during the years of apartheid in our land. Sadly, I was completely unaware of what was going on in our country. I was literally ensconced in a bubble of privilege. Towards my late teens, early 20s, I started becoming aware of what was going on in our country, of some of the horrors that my people were inflicting on the people of South Africa. And it resulted in a lot of grief, a lot of shock, a lot of tears, mourning, and I think that hasn't, really ended. It's not like you can just have one episode and just say, okay, well, we're over that. The implications and the repercussions of something as terrible as apartheid last for generations. And so my grief as well is ongoing. I'm sure you've all heard of the, after the Second World War, when the League of Nations was trying to become the United Nations, and they kept using words like never again. Never again must we allow this type of atrocity to happen in the world, and that's obviously in a global context. But for me, I think what happened around about this time in my life was I had what I like to call a personal never again moment. And it was when I decided that never did I want my privilege to blind me and keep me in ignorance to other people's suffering. Never did I want my sense of smallness about myself, like what can you do anyway, you're just one person. Never again did I want that my sense of smallness to stop me from becoming involved and doing things in situations. Never did I want my heart to become hardened by prejudice or fear of people who perhaps looked different from me or sounded different from me or worshiped differently from me. And never did I want the magnitude of a situation to stop me and paralyze me and render me apathetic. I never wanted to look at global events and think, wow, this is just so complex or so huge, or there's so many crises going on at the moment, so I'm just going to get paralyzed and do nothing. And so at that time, I determined that I'm going to open my eyes. I'm not going to stay in ignorance. I'm not going to just let my privilege dictate to me what I look at and where I go with my life. That actually I'm going to open my eyes. Actually, I'm going to open my heart, and I'm going to get involved. I'm going to see the situations that are before me. I'm going to not shy away from suffering, from people's pain, no matter the cost to me, whether that be psychological, financial, or time. And that's how I started getting involved on both locally and internationally. Obviously, as we all know, we have a lot of problems in our own country. A lot of them, the repercussions of apartheid and everything else that has been discussed so far in the conference as well. And then there are matters, obviously, internationally. And so, as you know, this session is called Societies in Distress. And I feel that one of the biggest areas in the world that's in distress right now is the Middle East. And so I want to just take a couple of minutes. This part is going to be very brief, just about 2 lines on 3 of the countries that I feel really deserve our attention and our intervention. And then I'm going to speak about my first loves and my passion. So the first country I want to mention in the Middle East, do I push end? Next, enter. Sorry, there we go, thanks. I just thought I'll put a map up just because I find it helpful often. I sort of think often that I know where these countries are, and I've traveled there many times, but I find a map helps. So the first country I want to talk about is Yemen. Yemen is in its 7th year of conflict between the Saudi-backed government forces and the Houthis. There are gross violations of human rights being perpetrated on both sides. Their currency is completely failed and stagnant. It's a disaster. Over half of the population are acutely food insecure. They have huge problems with ecological disasters. They've had torrential rains currently. They also have drought, which is getting worse every year. They have corruption on the level that only us and probably Lebanon know about. So they really are a country in dire need, and obviously COVID has exacerbated everything. The next country, the next country that I'd like to talk about is Lebanon. Lebanon comes off the back of its own crisis in the 80s, and off the back of that, there's continuing internal political instability. They actually have, at the moment, one of the 3rd worst financial and economic crises in the world since the mid-1800s. That's fairly big. Something else about Lebanon that I'm not sure how many of you know, they actually have, thank you so much, they actually have 25% of their population are refugees. That's 1 in 4. Mostly Palestinians fleeing 1948 Nakba and 1967, and in between times as well, but many, many Syrians now as well fleeing from the war. So they are under strain themselves, plus this added burden of refugees, a lot of infighting, mistrust of government, lot of corruption. And then add to that the explosion of the grain silo, add to that, COVID, and then it's putting not only the Lebanese, who 3/4 of them fulfill the criteria of being poverty-stricken. 3/4 of Lebanese. And what happens when a situation gets desperate is that people turn on to the most vulnerable in the communities. And that, in the case of Lebanon, is often the refugees. And so there is a lot of violence, mob violence, attacking and discrimination, xenophobia against the refugees. It's another country that needs our attention and intervention. And lastly, I'll just briefly mention Iraq. Obviously, off the back of the 2003 invasion, and then their own war against ISIS in 2014 to 2018, they have had a lot of internal strife and a lot to deal with that has convulsed the region, actually. This comes off the back of a lot of mistrust, again, of government and state structures. There's a lot of corruption there as well, a lot of internally displaced people, 2 million internally displaced people, and a lot of tensions and violence on a sectarian level and also tribal. I think the Kurds and Yazidis are probably the most, they struggle, they're the most affected, but everyone in Iraq is suffering. And again, they're having major weather issues affecting crops and also the problems of COVID exacerbating everything. So, yeah, I just wanted to mention these things as the subject matter is conflict zones in the Middle East. So we have to cover more than just Syria and Palestine. But coming now to the bulk of my talk, I think often, if we, beyond the headlines, often we get distracted by the headlines or by the overwhelming numbers, the mind-numbing statistics. We get distracted by the intellectualizing and theorizing of definitions. I'm sure you've all heard people talking about, does this constitute a war crime? Or is this actually anti-Semitism? Those type of things. And those, I'm not saying any of those things are not important. The geopolitics, as much as I'm fascinated by that, and it is important. But beyond all of these things, the numbers, the geopolitics, the definitions, there are people. Human beings like you and me. And it's these people that I want to talk about today. Obviously, in my small way, I can't do much. I mean, I do try, but, I'm not the head of the UN or something. And I just feel one of the ways I can, and one of the ways I love to convey dignity to people in the Middle East is by telling their stories. The stories of people that I've met, the stories of people that I know. These are people who it's unlikely anyone's ever going to write a book about them. It's unlikely anyone's going to make a film about them or tell their stories in any. They're not going to become famous. But by telling their stories, by remembering them, I feel we give them dignity. We tell them their suffering is not in vain. Their death was not in vain. And their struggles for freedom are not in vain. And so, that brings me to Syria. I first went to Syria with Gift of the Givers in 2013. That's a subject for a whole another day and another talk. I could talk for days actually weeks about that experience. And it's changed my entire life. I fell unashamedly in love with the Syrian people and the Middle East, and when I say involved, it's probably bordering more on obsessed with the Middle East and the Syrian people. And so I've just endeavored to stay involved with them, to go as often as I can to help, to not tire of their crisis, of their situation, whether it be personally, messaging friends, supporting, etc. But today, I just want to bring you, unfortunately because of time, just 2 stories of people that I met. I literally have thousands, but obviously time is a factor. So the first person I want to tell you about, after going to Syria, when the borders got closed, we couldn't go into Syria, and so in order to help, I went with NGOs, Syrian NGOs, but they're based in the US, and they lead trips, and one of them was to Za'atari refugee camp in the northeastern part of Jordan. And we would be bussed in with UNHCR assistance into the camp, which is like a prison, and then see patients, and then come back to stay in Amman in the evenings. And one of the evenings, they said they were going to take us to a safe house where we could meet some people and some ladies who had gotten involved. And this safe house is called Suriyat, Across Borders. For those Arabic students amongst us, Suriyat is like plural, the plural word of Syrian women. And these were 5 Syrian women that just felt, what can they do to, 10 minutes, what can they do to help their people and to get involved? They can't be on the front lines, they're not doctors. And so they banded together and bought a house in Jordan and started taking care of people that needed neuro rehab. So paraplegics, quads, hemis, amputees, brain injuries. Just incredible. And so I was sort of quite emotional when I went in there with the group. Just seeing all these people. First person that I got to know was Nizar, just quadriplegic, shot by a sniper, couldn't even sit up, had to be strapped into his chair, 19 years old, beautiful boy. catheter, and you can imagine all the rest that goes with that. Basil, 8 years old, lost both legs and his one arm, had partial use of the other arm. Absolutely delightful, full of joy and life, and very mischievous. Learned to swim, dives in, swims, just a delightful boy. And there were many more. But there was one boy that was sitting in the corner that caught my eye. And so I just went along and spent some time with him. His name is Muhammad. You can put the picture up of that boy, please. This is a picture of him. His name is Muhammad. It's coming. And I just got to know him, was chatting. I had an interpreter using my rudimentary Arabic and the interpreter. And he was telling me, I said, when last did you see your family? He's 16. 2 years prior, he'd seen his family. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's hectic. That was when he was also shot by a sniper. He's a paraplegic in a wheelchair. The stories I could tell about the snipers and everything else that goes on in Syria would keep us here for days. But anyway, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's hectic. You know, haven't seen your family for so long. And he saw that I was a bit distressed by that. He said, no, don't worry. These people have become like family to me in Suryat. And anyway, I was very emotional. They put on a huge feast for us, and obviously I couldn't eat. I mean, here are the real victims of the war, and they're busy feeding us and pampering us, and oh my gosh, it was too much. And then I just decided at the end of the mission that I'm going to go back and visit them. Often I stay on an extra couple of days. That, to me, is sort of where the magic happens. And so I went back to visit and spent time with Muhammad. We were chatting, getting to know each other, and with the other boys as well. And then at one stage I said to him, Muhammad, has anyone ever told you that you're beautiful? And so, of course, he was shy and saying, no, of course not. And I said to him, well, you are very beautiful. Shortly after that, they said it's lunchtime, and he asked if I could come and have lunch with them. And I said, of course, just watching how each of them taking care of each other, wheeling the wheelchairs down, putting the catheters on the other side, feeding each other, just in the most dignified way, the most normal way. But it was just incredible. But the one thing I noticed was that Muhammad was eating a lot, like literally 4 bowlfuls. Even his friends were like, Muhammad, what is going on with you, you know? And but anyway, he was enjoying it and carrying on. And a little later, I had to leave. And one of Muhammad's friends came to me and he asked Muhammad what was going on, why he was eating so much. And Muhammad said, when that lady told me that I was beautiful, I felt like a man for the first time. And so I thought, I need to eat like a man. The next story, and I'll try and keep it brief, is I was it's a different time that I went back to Jordan, to the Za'atari refugee camp. It was the end of the day. The buses were waiting. UNHCR was saying, hurry up, we need to go. A little bit like... and I was finishing off. I had one more patient, and I had finished off, given him his script. And I said and the interpreter was with me, and we were trying to hurry up. So as he got up, I said goodbye. And then in Arabic, I said ma'as salama. And then I said to him, Hibbu Surya, which means I love Syria. And the interpreter and I were quickly packing our bags, and because we knew they were waiting, and the patient made his way to the door. And then I heard sort of some stumbling. And I thought, oh my gosh, I hope, because he was on crutches. So I thought, I hope he hasn't fallen. And then I saw that he was actually crying. So I quickly brought a chair and said, sit down, are you okay? You know, through the interpreter. And he was crying for a good 5 minutes, which is a very long time if someone's crying and the buses are waiting. I said, please tell me what's going on. And he just said that when I'd said to him, I love Syria, it had just opened the floodgates, and his story just came to the fore. and he was overwhelmed. And what had happened was that his wife and his adult daughter had been kidnapped by the Syrian regime. The Mukhabarat, the secret police, had kidnapped them. This was 4 years prior to me being there. And in those 4 years, he had not been able to find any trace of them. This is what happens. That's, again, a subject for a whole talk on its own. But they called it Disappeared of Syria, and it is and it is a phenomenon that happens and that Bashar al-Assad has used to try and ruin the fabric of society. And he had sold both his homes. He had gone from police station to everywhere, to prison, to government officials, just trying to find and locate. He had spent every cent he had, and now he was in the refugee camp. And he was just weeping, saying how he knows what kind of torture and suffering that they're enduring there. Part of him is feeling guilty, but wishes they'd already died so they weren't suffering. But another part of him really just wishes that he could find them, get news of them. And obviously, I mean, this is a very big story and just huge amounts, indescribable amounts of pain and torment that he'd been going through. And so, just quiet for a while. What do you even say to someone who has a story like that? I just waited, and then through the interpreter, I just said to him, I'm very aware and cognizant of the fact that we have different religions, but would you be okay with the fact if we just prayed together? And before the interpreter had even finished asking him, he just grabbed my hands and said, please, please, let's pray. And I just prayed my very best prayer, also through tears, just that God would comfort him, that would bring him news of his family, of his daughter, and wife, either that they had passed, that he could get closure and grieve and mourn, or that he would get renewed hope that he can carry on looking for them. I have to move on now to Palestine. I'm just going to say a very few short words about Palestine. We can just go on to a blank slide now, just a blank one. I think a lot of us tire of Palestine, the stories in some ways, because it's been going on for so long, and you just think, well, you know what, maybe this is always going to be like this and whatever. But actually, things are getting worse there. And actually, we need to get involved. I recently was in Palestine, and there were 3 South African men that I met there. And they were black men. They are black men. And the reason I mention their color is because they have been part of the struggle. They were victims of apartheid during the apartheid years in this country. They have been imprisoned. They have been tortured. They were part of the struggle, carrying the cards, the pass cards, and etc. And when they came back and were giving their messages they met with Israeli and Palestinian people, when they were giving their messages to government and to other civil organizations, they said the apartheid in Palestine is infinitely worse than it was in South Africa. Another friend who's lived there, she's an author and a professor at a university in the US. She lived there during the early 2010s in Palestine, studied at Birzeit University. She's then been out of the country for 10 years and came back recently now to visit the people that she met. And she said she was horrified at the changes. So I could go on, but I'm just saying things are getting worse. The people are at a tipping point. The daily queuing at the checkpoints, the humiliation, the violence, I know. The violence. It is an untenable situation, and it deserves our attention. The occupation is a sin against God and man. It must end. It's going to need us, all of us, on grassroots levels, and I know you guys are so involved, much more so than my guys. So just deeply grateful for what you all are doing. But I just want to encourage you and all of us that these situations in the Middle East, they need our attention. They need our intervention. And I'm just going to end with one sentence before I get kicked off. As I mentioned at the beginning, that I was brought up in privilege. And I've come to realize that privilege and being blessed is not an end in itself. It's not something that we just say, well, thanks God, you know, I'm privileged, I've got enough, a good education, etc. It comes with a weighty responsibility, in my feeling, that we can come alongside those who are suffering, that we can amplify the voices of those being silenced. And as Nelson Mandela said, the purpose of our freedom is to create it for others. And this is the way that we can do to other people what we would want them to do if we were in their situations. Thank you.